Greetings, Mason County. Ryan Spurling, Mason County Sheriff's Office.
And Carole Beason from the Shelton Police Department.
Today we're going to talk about the first House Bill 1310 in this series, and we're going to go over some of the changes that are occurring.
In response to some of the comments we got from our first video, Chief Spurling and I thought it might help to give folks an idea of what resources we have available here in Mason County and in the Shelton Police Department. Just to give you some perspective on what we're handling out there, on the Shelton Police Department, well, back up, the City of Shelton is 6.2 square miles. And last year, the officers in the Shelton Police Department responded to over 14,000 calls for service. So that is roughly just under 40 calls a day. Now, you would think that we'd have an army of cops to handle those calls, but I can tell you on every watch, we have 3 officers if everyone shows up for their shift that day. But our minimum staffing for every watch is 2 officers to handle all those calls for service. And Ryan, you want to talk about the county?
Absolutely. Mason County Sheriff's Office, we cover on average the last 3 years 24,000 911 calls or calls for service a day. And that's approximately 70 calls a day, and that can vary anywhere from 50 to 100 calls a day depending upon the season. We have 1,000 square miles to cover. We have the National Park, the National Forest, which includes all the rescues up there. We have the Hood Canal, the Puget Sound, and 200 lakes that we cover. And we have all the way from Belfair to all the county lines. And at any one point on a really good day, I have about 6 deputies working the streets. So they're handling all those calls, 70 calls for service, in one day over that big of an area. And this is just something that we as agencies are up against. We would love to be able to deal with every call for service to the best of our ability. It's just that we have limited resources, and we do usually have to prioritize what calls we go to, how much time we spend at those calls.
And that's another part of the reason that it's not unusual for you to see an officer from the Shelton Police Department and a deputy from the Mason County Sheriff's Office responding to the same call, because neither of us have all of the resources that we need. Therefore, a lot of times we have to work together so that we can provide our community with the best service possible.
Okay, 1310, we're going to jump into this a little bit. The biggest thing we want you to walk away with, because it's kind of complicated and we could get really into the weeds, but we're going to give you resources so that you can look at it if you want to. But for the most part, you need to understand that law enforcement's ability to respond to a mental health crisis has been limited until a crime has committed. There's a few exceptions on that.
So keep in mind, historically, as law enforcement, we aren't mental health professionals, but we have been able to respond and determine whether or not a person is either a danger to themselves, a danger to others, or gravely disabled to the point that they can't take care of their own needs. And we've been able to take those folks to get them the treatment that they need, whether they want to go with us or not. But that is going to change now with House Bill 1310. Moving forward, if that person on a mental health call is acting erratically and they meet that criteria, but they are not willing to go with us voluntarily, we no longer have that legal authority to take them if they don't want to go with us willingly.
Until they commit a crime. And then at that point, we do have the authority. So that's why a lot of these things, unfortunately, whereas before we could help take them into custody for an ITA, now we have to wait until a crime occurs. And I'm sure we're going to be working through this process as law enforcement and mental health professionals and the legislature works through this. Some of the other things that we're dealing with is provocation. We cannot go, for example, if somebody is suicidal, we can't go there if just the mere presence of a law enforcement officer is going to provoke it. And if they're not committing a crime towards somebody else, we have to really measure whether or not we're allowed to respond.
And for those families that have dealt with family members that suffer from mental illness, if they tend to be in crisis and they've had several incidences where they've been contacted by law enforcement, just that mere presence of someone showing up in uniform may trigger that use of force. And so ideally, we want mental health professionals to be able to deal with folks so that just the mere presence of a uniform isn't going to start a use of force contact.
So let's go over the scales a little bit about what's changing. In the past, we've always had a sliding scale From the time a call is given, officers try to develop what is called reasonable suspicion, and we'll provide these definitions on a link. Before, we could take somebody into custody or use force if necessary at this area. The new law says we cannot take somebody in custody or use force until we reach probable cause, which is a higher level of proof. And obviously the highest level is where we get a conviction if it's beyond a reasonable doubt. This may be confusing to you. We're not here to try to confuse you, but we do have those definitions available. And the biggest change is we can no longer use force at this level. We have to wait for a seizure or a use of force until a crime has committed.
And just to try to put this in a little more of a layman's terms, something that would be reasonable suspicion, you'll hear people say, well, I know what I know, but can I prove that? So if you think that you've got a hunch that somebody's been involved in criminal activity, that's your reasonable suspicion. I have a hunch. But you take that hunch and then you start trying to collect evidence that helps support your case. And when you have evidence, which would be you have the fruits of a crime, or they give you a statement, or you find other evidence, or you have a witness statement, all of these things help you build to the point of probable cause. And then once you have that probable cause, that's where you can make your arrest. And then you continue that investigation until you get enough evidence to show that beyond a reasonable doubt, this person is the one that committed this crime.
So that's the most significant point of 1310. So that's this first one. We're going to go into the next House bill on our next episode. Until then, thanks.
And if you have any questions about this, please feel free to give us a call.